Hi, Misha here, and as promised, we're going to do a deep dive into another FAL, the South African R1, and by extension, Rhodesia. We actually have not one, but two examples. This is the one you saw me trade for right before I went on break, vacation, what have you. It's in the kind of more original black scheme. And this is one loaned to us by a friend that is in the more painted up scheme. And it is a different variation, and we'll look at some of the differences in the parts too. And there's tons of variations in these because they were really produced from 1960 to 1990, and hundreds of thousands were made in South African, Rhodesian history, African history. Very fascinating. Now, there are no pre-ban imports in America. Every single one we have is built from a parts kit, and every single one, as far as I know, came out of former Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, all that stuff. So, with that in mind. So before we do a dive into these, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, you know the drill. Check out the link to Patreon. With that, let's go back to the late 50s. South Africa, former British colony, protectorate, whatever you want to call it. And they need a new rifle. Since South Africa was closely aligned with Britain, the Commonwealth, and thus what would form into NATO, the South African Defense Force, the SAD, would very quickly select 7.62 NATO 308 as the new cartridge. But which rifle to go with? And they really looked at all the practicable options in 1959 when the initial trials began. While I'm not sure how far it made it, they did examine the Swiss SIG SG510. I'm not sure which dash model, but I'm sure it was in 7.62, not 7.5. I would imagine the weight and the cost were prohibitive, but you do see the 510 popping up in trials in this era very, very frequently, although it only won a handful around the world. Of course, the FAL was there by this point, 1959. It is a mature platform. I picked the Cuban again because it's a pretty good representation of what would have been on offer. Still wood handguards. Now, this has the wrong flash hider, would not have had a Type B, generally speaking, would have had still a lugged barrel, which was more popular than the Type B. But a Type C wood stock, Type 1 receiver. And right alongside it would have been what most websites consider the German HKG3, and it's very likely that it was marketed via Heckler & Koch for international purposes. I'm not sure, but that was the same year the Bundeswehr just adopted the SETME Model B in a modified form as the G3, so I don't actually know if these were true German guns or true Spanish guns, or a combination sent through one nation or another. It doesn't really matter. South Africa definitely looked at the roller delayed version, full length, that would have had wood furniture, phosphate finish, the early style sights, 20 round mag, all that. Again, a very new design, although its roots dated back to World War II. So it's maturing quickly itself. But then, kind of the wild card from America, not the M14, but rather Armalite AR-10. Now this is the Portuguese, sometimes called the NATO version. This is a little later than what they would have had, but it would have been still after the Sudanese version. So probably pretty similar to the transitional or the Cuban model, with features from both. And this really was the most advanced gun in a lot of ways, at least its manufacturing and material and just overall concept was, the most forward-thinking. The Swiss gun was knocked out early on for whatever reasons. That left these three. Based on some anecdotal evidence and just what I've been able to dig up, the R10 was quite intriguing to South Africa. And they did seriously consider it, and it did quite well, all things considered, in the trials. And Portugal would end up adopting it and using it in Africa later on. So it was up to the challenge, at least the later versions. But I think it was just a little too experimental, and so it was knocked out. That left it down to the SETME/G3 or the metric European style FAL. Again, I don't know exactly why they chose one over the other. One has to speculate that perhaps because Britain and much of its allies were using the FAL, that was attractive. Also, this was a stamped receiver design. And we think of stamping today as cheap and efficient, but this was quite new technology for the 1950s and 60s. The FAL was made with a machined receiver and most other machined parts, especially at this era, which is more traditional. I suspect that since South Africa was wanting to produce under license whatever they adopted, they probably quite rightly saw that the FAL would just meet their manufacturing capabilities better without requiring wholly new everything. Again, it's a matter of perspective. Think about what was going on at the time in manufacturing, not how things are today, of course. And trials would continue on with down select into the early period of 1960. And later on that same year, after deliberating, the South African Defense Force would adopt the FNFAL, or at least, of course, a version of it. And this is also around the same time when defense spending was being increased because the military and the police were increasing in responsibilities because of apartheid, the Nelson Mandela trial, and other types of political unrest going on in the country, which just in a few years would have some international and economic repercussions for South Africa. But it's getting slightly ahead of ourselves. So later in the year 1960, they pick the FNFAL, which is already making a name for itself. It's also kind of going through a bit of a transitional phase. So this one here, this wasn't how the original rifles initially adopted as M1 looked. In fact, there are lots of sub-variations, but three distinct kind of phases. After South Africa selected the FAL and the 7.62 NATO cartridge, they ordered an initial batch of 25,000 from Belgium. And these would be kind of an interesting mix. In fact, this gun over here, withstanding the paint, kind of represents some of that a little better. They had non-bipod cut handguards, and they had a Type C wood buttstock. And they originally had a wood carry handle, but most of those carry handles in any service got replaced because the wood carry handles were very prone to breaking. Now this one's on a US receiver. Yes, it's Hess or Hesse. The reason he did it, back in the day, he was trying to build the cheapest FAL he could. Yeah, believe it or not, back then, the R1s kits were the cheapest. And he succeeded, and it actually runs fine. Anyway, just thought I'd point that out. So this is a Type 3. They would have been on just standard Type 1s back then. And they also would have had originally a lugged barrel, that kind of thing. That was the original look for the first batch from FN, 1961, there and so forth. The next step, though, would be setting up production in South Africa. They didn't want to just buy, they wanted to produce. So at first they would send their own engineers from Littleton Engineering Works, Littleton with a Y, which operated under Armscor, which is South Africa's arms industry for manufacturing and development. And they would send some folks up to Europe to learn, and then they would come back with some Belgians to help set up production in South Africa. And from there, Belgium would start shipping more parts than complete guns over. Basically, do-it-yourself kits. And they would start assembling guns from kits in 1962, give or take. And this would be the second batch. Now, this batch, built with Belgian parts in South Africa, by South Africans with Belgian supervision and assistance, and more South African parts creeping in. They'd still have Type C wood buttstocks, and they'd still have non-bipod cut handguards. But this is when the quite unique South African grenade sight would appear, with this second iteration. Pretty cool, and really about the only gun I can think of that had this. And this would be around 1963. This is right when the new muzzle device, the combo device, the 22mm would be coming. So this would replace the lugged barrel. There are some South African guns that have the Type B flash hider. It's a little interesting among those if they were just traditional guns sent over or if they were actually surplus guns from elsewhere, stories thing. I just wanted to mention that really brief. But with this second batch, you have this new flash hider and this, but you still have a wood stock and non-bipod cut handguards. And like this one here, you still would have a scalloped trigger guard and some other features. And they'd still be on essentially the standard Type 1 receivers. And there'd be one other change. The original Belgian contract guns are the ones that had the South African crest on the receiver. And those kind of became famous because for the Rhodesian guns, a lot of them were sanitized. And by sanitized, a lot of them just had a drill put through. So you effectively had a hole in your receiver down here on this kind of magwell flange. No big deal. Kind of just a unique thing. But with the second batch and moving forward, as receivers were made and things were made in South Africa, that would disappear. Rather, another mark would appear. The UM or MU, essentially standing for the Military of the Union of South Africa. And this would hang around for a while, but not forever. I just wanted to clarify the UM or MU marking, if you prefer, is not a factory stamp of proof as such. It's a property stamp of the SADF. So it was applied, at least on some, retroactively to the FN, the Belgian guns, and it's also on other equipment and gear. But as far as I know, with this generation of R1s, it was on there either right as they left the factory or put on immediately as it was accepted into Army service. And this is a Kunin receiver. Normally, Kunins are cast. I try to stick with DS Arms, but this really works well. It says R1, and it has the mark. Now, believe it or not, I'm actually considering taking that UM off, and we'll explain why when we get to the Rhodesians, and I'm sure most of you already know. But what I do like about it, aside from saying R1 or not, it has the correct cuts and everything. It's the unique Type 1 for South Africa. So I just wanted to point out that around this time, the markings did change. So in '63, a few things happened. We have kind of the next big batch of Belgian stuff. They're really getting ready to set up at Loo under Armscor production. And then that year, the UN passed a voluntary embargo on South Africa politics. They're not getting into it. But it really didn't matter because by that point they were up and running. They had enough stuff, know-how. And thus, September 23, 1964, the first wholly South African built gun was complete and presented to the Prime Minister, and it's actually in a museum today. And this is the style here, effectively a third variation South African. For what it's worth, South African production began at serial number 200,001, so 200001. As far as I know, they produce these sequentially, but I could be wrong. The wood stock to the polymer, it has this kind of unique slab side butt plate, and if you've noticed, the stocks on South Africans are longer, the wood and the polymer. This was the first time we have the polymer style stock. And what the South African receivers, the lightning cut here is more rounded off. Sometimes this is called a type 1.5. Really what it is, it's like a type 2 receiver if you look at the lightning cut on a type 2, but it doesn't have the area here. It's just without that. So it's kind of a, 1.5 works because it really is a little bit of type 1, a little bit of type 2, and is a unique receiver to South Africa. A regular type 1 would work. I mean, the first several tens of thousands of R1s, originally known as M1, by this time R1, had the type 1 receivers, so either one really would be appropriate. Type 3, no, but that's okay. Like I said, he was doing it to see how cheap he could build NFN FAL because, again, these kits, very inexpensive back in the day. Something else I should point out. You notice this has the horizontal takedown. Of course, originally, these all had the vertical style, and the first ones were just your standard type, but this has the kind of unique South African style. I think maybe one other Belgian used this, but kind of the late style vertical before they went to the horizontal. I think that's kind of neat about this lower. But what would happen is they would swap parts out and replace them. They would go to the horizontal, like right here. Pretty standard pistol grip, a little different, but pretty standard. Standard handguards. The grenade sight would remain kind of an iconic piece of the R1. This is one version. There's one other, the short style, but you don't see many of those. It seems like they didn't make near as many. Non-bipod cut handguards would remain. Non-bipod cut 21-inch barrel. This is the original South African barrel. And we have the combo device here. What's kind of interesting though, this is an early style combo device. Later style Belgians, they would actually move the wrench flats and make a few other minor changes. But since, 63 was kind of the cutoff point, they have the early style. You see the early style on a lot of Israelis too. Speaking of Israeli, this is a good time to mention earlier and later attempts at rifle grenade launching from the FAL platform. But first, having them side by side, you can really see the difference in length of the stock. The South African has an extended length, and the Israeli actually has a slightly shortened length compared to normal. So these two side by side are very, very apparent. And of course, as I said already, the earliest South African FALs would have a bare muzzle lugged barrel, just like this one here. And they did have a way of launching rifle grenades with this device. It slides on using the same lug as the bayonet, and it has a spring-loaded plunger to lock it on. And then you would manually deploy the sight. But then you would also have to rotate this here, and it can very easily, pop off if you go the wrong direction. Most FALs do have this. For some reason, this one likes to pop off both ways. I don't know why on this gun, but either way, that's your gas cutoff there for launching grenades. And you can understand why that whole process of attaching and flipping and turning isn't ideal. The next thing FN tried out was the QD device system on the G1. We already did a full video on the G1. This was its device that also attached with its lug, but instead of just going straight on, it actually twisted on with about a 90-degree throw and used this wire to secure it. You would still have to rotate the plug, though. Now, Steyr would have the Stoll flash hider, and they would actually make the cutoff a little better. But still, here we have probably the best solution. Like I said, the 22mm device was introduced in 1962-63 and screwed on. They would go from right hand to left hand threads at this point. And as we've already looked, when you press in here, it rotates around, not only giving you your sight for aiming, but also turning off the gas, and it's quite difficult to do it the wrong direction and have your system spring out. So it's the more elegant design, and it really shows the importance that everyone was placing on rifle grenades in the early 60s. As mentioned, the version that South Africa adopted and manufactured and used was the earlier style combo device. Here is a later one. Very, very similar, but the wrench flights are slightly moved up. And this later version is ever so slightly longer, just a tiny bit. Otherwise, the internal threads, as we discussed, for blank fire, and that's why the edge is serrated, so your blank fire device's plunger can lock in there securely. It works as a 22mm launcher. It has internal threads for a blank fire device, and of course, as you know, it has a notch in the bottom for a bayonet. And of course, we have a new style of bayonet, the Type C. Here's your Type C bayonet. This is a polymer scabbard. Some early ones were metal. South Africa used both. Very simple, but also very robust, if I'm being honest. So it has a little string on it from the previous owner. He always put little strings on his things. There we go. And of course, you know how it goes. The holes line up with the flash slots, so it can still be used. And really, yeah, compared to the previous bayonet attempts, this is more effective. And no, I don't believe, it's really hard to tell these bayonets apart. This is definitely not a South African scabbard. But again, they had Belgian ones too. So since I don't have a South African to show you, to make up for it, I brought this out real quick. This is South African. This is an infield number 9 bayonet for the number 4 rifle. And what's unique about the South African is they used Uzi blades with infield sockets. And they actually usually stuffed them into whatever scabbard they had, including the US M8 or M8A1. They would even, I'm curious if this will fit just for fun. No, didn't think so because of the throat. But yeah, they had what they called the universal scabbard. And it would work for FALs their own Uzis. And of course, even these. But yeah, South Africa not only licensed the FAL from FN, they also licensed the Uzi. So, brought that out just for fun. Sorry, little digression there. We'll move on. No, the original guns that had the lugged barrel were updated to kind of the newer standard. If the wood stock, like on this one, was self-serviceable, they'd leave it. But most everyone would get the gas plug. And as far as I know, they would all get the combo device. They'd thread the barrel or just replace the barrel if it was worn out, which is probably what happened to this barrel. So there was more or less an updated standard from the original M1 to the later R1 style. Like I said, the third variation featured the all-polymer look and this, and we had a few different parts. And by this point, the trigger guard's the later straight style versus the scalloped. And you can go on and on and on about little details because a lot of the South African parts are just ever so slightly different in their manufacture. Like the pistol grip is a little different. You know, we've got the selector markings you see, as I already mentioned, the butt plate. And this is not a South African sling, but it fit. They used whatever. They used infield slings. They had that one sling that would later be used on their Galil. So that I mentioned that. Gas piston, all that's normal. It's almost a standard, and the charging handle is the polymer one, of course. It's almost a standard gun, but not quite. Pretty unique. But by 64, they were up and running at Littleton under Armscor, and they started cranking these suckers out. Now, sometime in the 70s, the UM or MU would seemingly disappear, and there are some other little minor variations we'll see. But they were rolling these out and issuing them, and they would have a few variations. Now, the R1 is your standard rifle, like I said, fixed stock 21-inch barrel. The R3 was essentially the same, but semi-automatic only, meant for mainly the police. Sorry, we can't import them because they're built on the same receiver, you know, once a machine gun, that whole crap. There was also the R1 heavy barrel, kind of a cross between this and an FALO. And then there's the paratrooper, which definitely existed. It had a 21-inch barrel, folding stock, and interestingly, it used a standard rear sight, the 2 to 600 meter rear sight, which is unique. And we've seen some South Africans with the alloy lower as well, so they were like 50, 64s. As far as I know, those were made in Belgium for the most part. Of course, they would have been refurbished in, you know, parts. The reason I'm not calling it a name is some insist that it's called an R2. Some say, no, it was called an R1 para or whatever. I don't know. But commonly on the internet, they're referred to as the R2. And that's the folding stock version. And you can definitely find pictures of shorter barrels, say 18 inches. I really don't know if that's factory or if they're cut downs in the field. Either one is probably likely. But they would do variations. Of course, they're all in 7.62. Although there were some efforts to do some other calibers that never really went much of anywhere. And they would serial match the bolt carrier, the upper, the lower, that kind of thing. And keep on cranking them out. Now, in 1978, South Africa would officially adopt the Israeli Galil ARM, at least their variation of it, longer stock included, is the R4, and the Galil SAR is the R5. The R6 would come much later. By this point, there's embargoes and sanctions. South Africa is not on good terms with the international community. However, Israel, they do some stuff, both of them, to kind of get around and do this, and their relationship will last for a little while, and then it too kind of falls apart because that's how these things go. But my point is, even though the R4, R5 were adopted in the late 70s and into production by the 80s, they would still be making some R1s in variations. In fact, the last production run on record was 1989. And it seems to have really just consisted of using up spare parts. And even though most of the military by the 1990s had switched away, there were some that continued to use them. They would use these as kind of DMRs, because of course the Galil clones, or not clones, but the Galil contract copies were firing 223, 556, but for longer ranges, the 7.62 NATO 308 essentially, was still considered better. The like park rangers, the border guards continue to use them. Some police forces. In fact, to this day in South Africa, some units still have R1s in inventory. But effectively, most were cycled out of service in the early 21st century or before. And they also had quite a large batch that they destroyed in the past to kind of appease international pressure, and of course with changing political tides and end of apartheid, and at least on paper, and all of that. So they destroyed roughly, I think, 250,000, which tells me they built quite a few of these. I've never seen an actual number of South African R1 production, but it was hundreds of thousands for sure. And they're mostly just cool for their history. What they are, aside from the grenade launcher plug, is pretty standard FAL, 20-round steel box mag, that kind of thing. And the South African ones were all in the black paint, as you see here. However, as I said at the beginning, all of these really came out of former Rhodesia. And this kit included, because it has RA is a Rhodesian serial number. And it has the South African marks on the lower defaced right there, which is actually why I'm considering taking the off this receiver just to match this down here. Haven't quite decided yet, because once it's done, it's done. Rhodesia. You know, it's famous for the R1s that served there, were used there in the Bush Wars. But let's start off that way. Rhodesia declared independence from Great Britain in 1965. And in the beginning, the L1A1 was essentially its de facto standard rifle. Rifles just like this BSA L1A1 SLR here. And going back to the early 60s, Britain supplied the colony protectorate of Rhodesia with small but consistent quantities of these. And Rhodesia would even supply some troops for joint operations with Britain during periods like the Malayan Emergency. So they were deployed out, and for all things are hunky-dory. Of course, this is what we consider an imperial or inch pattern FAL, and that actually would lead to a difference that I think later on would explain why this would not end up being frontline as such. SLR stands for self-loading rifle. Unlike the R1 and many other metric FALs, these were just safe, single shot, safe, semi-automatic only. That's because Britain emphasized long-range, directed, accurate, single shots versus burst fire. And Rhodesia would copy this mindset in its military, its army. Typically, you would have a small, very highly mobile squad of 5 or 6 men, with the majority equipped with the standard rifle, and one equipped with a machine gun, and the rifleman would support him. So that was the structure through the early and mid-60s. And specifically, Rhodesia would declare independence on November 11, Armistice Day, of 1965. Beginning in 1966, December, running through about 68, February, the UN passed a mandatory sanction on all of its members to basically not trade with Rhodesia. Again, politics, not getting into it. But that meant they couldn't get more weapons. At least not officially, not legally. But guess what? Smuggling exists. Portugal was really the main European supplier of small arms and equipment to Rhodesia. beginning in 1966, so technically starting before sanctions came down hard, but they knew they were on the way, and they would continue afterwards into 67, 68. Now, we mentioned, of course, the L1A1s, but interestingly, Portugal supplied Rhodesia with former West German Bundeswehr G1 rifles, so metrics. Why? Because Portugal themselves had bought them secondhand and it issued out some to its own military fighting in Africa. As I mentioned earlier, they had some AR-10s in theater, but they had plenty of these, and so they would transfer some down to Rhodesia. Why did they willingly support them even when it kind of went against the UN? And they had their own political reasons. But as I'm sure you know, the FAL was not something made in Portugal and not their standard issue rifle. No, that would be the G3. These were made under license in their country from Heckler & Koch, and they would supply them to Rhodesia alongside G1s. I would assume these are probably older G3s that they were cycling out, but they could have been new production. I'll be honest, I just don't know. Regardless, by 1967-68, these three rifles, all firing 7.62 NATO, so that's good, same cartridge, were in Rhodesia. However, they took different parts, especially the G3 versus the FALs, but they even took different magazines. But as early as 66, the G3 was partnered with the FAL, and the L1A1 was essentially cycled back to second line use. Although more L1A1s were brought in, not just British, but Australian, but these would be rather illegally brought in through the black market. And as you mentioned, West German G1s and BGSs came in, even some FN guns of other, whatever. It's the black market. It does black market things. So yeah, but by the late 60s, yeah, the FAL and the G3 are there. They're all secondhand though. South Africa was the first nation to actually give or sell Rhodesia new production guns, including R1s, right off the production line. Was this legal? No, hell no. Completely illegal. That's why markings started being scrubbed off real quick. Now, they would give them some older guns too. As I mentioned earlier, the Rhodesian guns sometimes have a hole drilled here, and that would have been where the FN crest would have been drilled off. So some of the original FN guns were... Two questions may come to mind. First, did they really think scrubbing off the markings, drilling them out, would fool anyone? Not really. It was plausible deniability, and just to fool or not give a UN inspector, if he happened to look at a rifle, a pretext to go anywhere. It was legal minutiae. That's just how it goes. Second, why not scrub all the other guns that had come in? Well, the L1A1s that had been there before November 65, they were there legitimately. As far as the other ones, the later L1A1s brought in, like the Aussies, the G1s, even the G3s, they were surplus. Yeah, they might have started off in whatever country, but how could you prove how they got there? It's just like a secondhand anything. So there was just no need. There was already built-in plausible deniability. Welcome to 1960s Cold War politics in Africa. Moving on, why were the L1A1s sent to second line and training use, at least predominantly? I don't know for sure, but I have a theory, and it does come down to the aforementioned magazines. Now, of course, the G3 took its own mag, absolutely. But let's just presume they liked them or they had enough mags. It didn't matter. So that leaves our 2 metric and 1 inch FAL. These models use the same magazine, but the L1A1s were the odd man out because part of the whole inch change was a different mag, and these would not fit in these. And with the support of South Africa, they would simply have more mags and more metric pattern guns. And I don't know how many magazines they had for their L1A1s, but as I already mentioned, they really emphasize conserving ammunition, at least before independence. So it's very likely they had a very limited supply of magazines for the L1A1, and that would limit their usefulness, whereas they had plenty of mags to fit the R1 and G1, and presumably plenty of G3 mags besides. Just being thorough, here are the differences. Obviously, the base plates are different, but that doesn't really affect fitting of the gun. No, it's the front latch. With the metric, it's a simple small dimple out of the sheet steel. With the inch, it's a much larger piece that is spot welded or brazed on to the front. Honestly, the inch mag is a better mag. However, yeah, that large thing is not going to fit in a hole for this small thing. Now, metric mags will fit in inch guns, but they're very loose and reliability is suspect at best. So that is my guesstimation as to why the L1A1s were kind of cycled back. I'm sure they were also running low on spare parts. Anyway, that's what the Rhodesian army did. And of course, these would go up against Kalashnikovs supplied by both Russia and China to different factions. So the 7.62 NATO cartridge did have the advantage in range and overall accuracy compared with 7.62 by 39, and a little bit harder hitting too, but of course heavier. Everything was heavier, so bit of a trade-off there. Between 66 and 74, South Africa supported Rhodesia in many ways, including R1 rifles and other equipment. And that's how the R1 officially kind of became a standard, at least for one side in the Rhodesian conflict. How many were sent over? No one knows for sure, but at least 30,000, maybe more. Good chunk, good number, considering the size of the conflict there in the Bush Wars. And in the beginning, they looked just like this one. They got the RA prefix serials we already looked at, but they were in black. Thing is, black rather shows up in the African bush, sub-Sahara, in that area. Also, as we kind of saw today when we were trying to film in the direct sun, black also heats up quite a bit. So, yeah, that's when the so-called baby poop camo came along. Now, this one is a build, and it has redone camo. And there's a lot of people online that get into exactly the right shades of the brown, green, what have you. But the truth is, it was just whatever paint they had. And it started off, as I'm sure you know, as aircraft paint, or at least paint they were using to just camouflage their low-flying kind of close air support aircraft. And so it was just literally hung on a rack and sprayed rather hastily, and so it wasn't a job that was done. They also would make some other field expedient changes. A lot of them had the carry handles taken off, and by that I don't mean they unscrewed it and did it nicely. No, they just snipped them off or twisted them off. They broke them off here, so there's just a dead wire. There's all kinds of stories about why. I don't know how confirmed they are. It doesn't really matter, but sometimes... But you know what's funny, though? Most of the kits I've seen had a carry handle, for whatever reason. They also would sometimes take off the front swivel. I've seen it said that it was done for noise. Oddly, they didn't remove the rear swivel. I guess it just didn't make enough noise. I've also heard that it's because Rhodesian troops were not expected to, to use a sling. This is not a light rifle. I don't know if I'd want to carry it all day in the bush. What if you got to take a leak or something? I like having a sling. But you will see the swivels sometimes removed on these. Now something else, you'll notice this barrel might look a little longer than this one. There's a reason for that. This black one here was just put together post sunset of the assault weapons ban. The federal ban put in 94 expired September 2004. So everything's normal here. 21-inch barrel. This one, even though the barrel does look shorter, is actually a 21-inch barrel. But this was put together during the ban. So what he did to make it look right is he hollowed out the muzzle device and he pinned it on here and here. That way it wasn't removable, because one of the features that was a no-no during the ban were essentially threads. It wasn't quite that simple, but also bayonet lugs. Now, you might wonder, this still has a notch here. Well, the way he pinned it, nope, can't go over the first hump, and I'm sure it couldn't go over the second. And this is a pretty worn, loose-fitting bayonet. So it has the notch, but a bayonet can't go on, and you can't unscrew it, and it doesn't effectively act as a flash hider because he slipped it over the barrel. That's another thing. So the ports are occluded, and he drilled the ones at the top out. That was a way of doing it back then, guys, and that's actually why the FAL was a popular build during the ban. Aside from the kits were everywhere and cheap, and receivers are available, you didn't have to do much. If you modified the muzzle device, and some kits, if it was a lug barrel, you don't have to even do that. Regular mags pre-ban were fine, and most every single kit was a fixed stock. I didn't see many folders back in the day. So you didn't have to do really much else. Even the grenade plug was fine because it wasn't a grenade launcher. I believe this is a US part. This pistol grip feels like it's US as well. Could be wrong. Of course, the receiver is. If you're doing a parts count, the FAL needs 7, which is kind of brutal, frankly, guys. You notice the mag here. Original paint. And Rhodesia would have had, whatever mags they could get. FN. There were rumors that Austrian STG-58 stuff made it over, but those seem to be false, and it actually seems to be mistaking West German stuff for Austrian. And of course, South Africa made their own mags, and they're actually made by a subcontractor. They weren't made directly by I think it was actually a bicycle company or a tire company, if memory serves, but I digress. Of course, most mags would be South African. And this would be what would be seen during the Bush Wars, at least on one side. Here's the thing, though. You had 4 or 5 sides fighting in total. You had, of course, the white governments. You had other Western-supported coalitions. But then you had 2 distinct communist sides, one backed by Russia and one backed by more China and that bloc. And sometimes they would fight against each other, sometimes they would fight beside each other, sometimes they would shift. It is a total mess. There's really no good guy in the whole Rhodesian Bush War thing. Everyone committed atrocities. Everyone had atrocities committed against them. And of course, most people who suffered were simply civilians caught in the middle. And that's the biggest tragedy of it all. It got to be so messy that in '74, even South Africa stopped supporting them. Could be that their side was losing too, but either way, it just became a whole thing. And just death and destruction. It's often been called Africa's Vietnam. Yeah, I get that. But it was an interesting piece in history, and it's an interesting look at, human nature, human behavior too. And that's why these kits quite interesting to me and a lot of people today. Once upon a time, the cheapest FAL kits and the ones that were looked over, myself included back then, I fully admit, today are among the most prized, for being honest, because their histories kind of come to light. And it does need to be remembered. Those people who died or lost their homes, lost loved ones, the only thing we can do for them now is remember them. Remember they lived. And, honor that thing. Regardless, 1979, the Rhodesian government itself fell, finally, and a new nation of Zimbabwe was formed. And the last fighting of the Bush Wars would end, and there would be a ceasefire February of 1980, bringing to end over a decade of fighting and destruction. But the new Zimbabwe government that replaced it wasn't really better than what it had come before. And that's because a gentleman named Robert Mugabe would serve as dictator of Zimbabwe from 1979 all the way until 2017. Not a good time. Nominally communist. His actual allegiance was just asshole, frankly. And don't get me wrong, the former Rhodesian government back in the 60s had a lot to answer for. But they weren't replaced with anyone better. And frankly, probably worse. Like I said earlier, no real good guys in that war. And that's not what this video is about to say one side. This is about history. And because I had a couple of these to share with you. I also wanted to point out, once Zimbabwe came around, the RA for Rhodesian serial number, where you would see some of these kits with ZA, and their paint would actually change. They would still baby poop paint them. Keep in mind I'm blind, but with that said, it seems like the paint would be more green, best I understand it. After the Bush Wars, Zimbabwe planned to make the R1, or FAL in general, its standard issue long arm. It had large stockpiles of 7.62 NATO, so it would collect them all up, give them a new serial number sometimes, and refurbish and replace parts as needed, giving the new paint scheme as mentioned. And that was the plan. But it would only last a few years because soon a large percentage of the ammunition was destroyed in a case of either a very unfortunate accident for them or much more likely a case of sabotage by disenfranchised or disgruntled former fighters. Therefore, as we roll into the 1990s, while they had plenty of R1s in stocks, they didn't necessarily have enough ammunition, so they were put into storage, more or less surplus to needs, and were replaced by Kalashnikovs. Again, as I said earlier, quite a few different AK variants were in country, thanks to the Soviet Union, China, others. So the FAL was replaced in frontline service, for the most part, except for special units and marksmen and all that, by various AKs. And thus its military service would come to the end right around the same time as the Cold War would come to an end. And that's it. The R1 would continue in Rhodesia into Zimbabwe for decades. And Then these kits would appear as it was retired out for the most part in the late 90s and early 2000s here. And they came in pretty much untouched. The good news is they had their barrels. The bad news is it was during the ban. I remember he found one of these that had a bunch of sand in the buttstock, and he actually collected it and put it in a jar. They came in with their painted up mags. But you know what? They work. We actually shot this gun over the eclipse day when we were out filming that. And yeah, even though it's on a Hess receiver, it works fine. Interestingly, this seems like it has a British hold open because it's a manual style. It doesn't have the pin inside. It doesn't have the but again, in Rhodesia they had all kinds of mixy matchy stuff, so I could easily see, yeah, this one has the large foot. This one seems to have Brit or Aussie, but pretty much anything's correct for these. And that's what's kind of neat about either a South African or Rhodey build. You can kind of configure it however you want, although not on a Type 3 receiver. But I wanted to do a deep dive. There's not a ton out there on these, and this is not at all exhaustive. There's tons more history. Keep in mind too, I can't see pictures, so there are things that I do miss. So feel free to correct me in the comments. As I said earlier, aside from the grenade launcher and the longer stock, this is a pretty standard FAL. So what really makes these intriguing is their history. That's just kind of what it is. But what a history it is. And like I said, it's worth remembering. Both African or South African and Rhodesian. And it's been a long time in coming. As I said in the video a couple months ago, I took this one in on trade for that LMT because I just really wanted a decent African build. But I knew what I wanted. I wanted it on a correct R1 receiver, either DSA or Kunin. I wanted the original barrel, and I wanted the right parts. I wanted African parts. I didn't really care if it was baby poop or black. Either one is correct for either era of Rhodesian conflict. But it just seemed like a missing link in the FAL collection. And I am happy with my decision to do the trade, even a couple months later. And these also are just a good example of a couple of different styles. This one, like I said, it's been rebuilt with the horizontal takedown, but still has the long wood stock. No trapdoor in the butt plate. That's just not how they rolled. And just kind of a brief look at the ways we made these kosher during the assault weapons ban. It was pretty silly, if I'm being honest, guys. But anyway, I'd love to hear about your unique FN FAL builds. Let us know in the comments. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Like to help support us, check out on Patreon. And we'll probably get one of these out to the cabin to shoot sooner than later. We need to do an FAL shoot day once it's pleasant out. It's getting there. It's a little warm still, but a couple more weeks, it'll be nice out. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.